Hello and welcome to our Fireside chat on security and the strategic context of trade. With me to discuss how the strategic context of trade has changed is Thomas Matussek. Thomas has had a long career in the German diplomatic service. He served as German ambassador to the UK, the United Nations and India, and as chief of staff to two German foreign ministers, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and Klaus Kinkel. Thomas has also headed the political department of the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin, but he's also no stranger to the commercial world. So obviously his role at Flint, but he's also been head of public affairs for Deutsche Bank. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm also joined by Stephen Evans, who also has a very long and distinguished career in the United Kingdom's diplomatic services. He was head of the South Asia department of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office before being appointed Chargé d'Affaires in Kabul, Afghanistan in 2001. He moved to become British High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, based in Colombo, Sri Lanka in 2002. Between 2006 and 2007, Stephen was the British ambassador to Afghanistan and returned to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 2007 as Director of Afghanistan Information Strategy. He's also been Assistant Secretary General to NATO in charge of operations and other roles within the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office and the Ministry of Defence. Welcome to you, Stephen. It's fair to say, since we last spoke last year, quite a lot has happened in a security and diplomatic context. Obviously, we're still reeling from the shock of COVID. We've had vaccine nationalism. This has changed the context of international relations because so many countries now are thinking about themselves first rather than taking a more multilateral framework. But we've also strategically had the NATO exit from Afghanistan, increasing technology and trade tensions between the United States and China, increasing oil prices, and a new administration in the White House. We've also, of course, had Brexit. So I guess my question is, how has the world changed since we spoke last year? Last year, we focused on sustainability. We looked at some of the challenges. What do you feel the major shifts are in the security context of trade? Thomas, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and also thank you for having me here. Well, you mentioned yourself a number of the things which have happened in the last year. The pandemic. We have seen a lot of new regional conflicts breaking out. Just to name a few, we have seen northern Ethiopia. We have had if you look at Afghanistan, we've seen the hasty withdrawal of our major partner, forcing us also to make a quick withdrawal and leave the country to the mercy of the Taliban. We have seen a more aggressive attitude of Russia in the Black Sea region, in eastern Ukraine, in Syria, and also in a way as a proxy war, the activity of Russians in parts of Africa, in the Sahel area, in Libya, the so-called Wagner Group. But of course, the main thing is, of course, China. China has adopted a more aggressive stand in the South China Sea around Taiwan, and not just militarily, but also in a way economically. If you look at China's relationship with a number of countries where they created new dependencies, which they then exploited, we have seen activity of China and Russia and others in the cyber world. We've seen enormous steps in developing new arms in China, the hypersonic weapon, for instance. So wherever we look, things seem to have deteriorated. But on the positive side, I think the most positive development is that President Trump isn't around any longer. And I'm saying this, I'm not saying this to be nasty or polemic, but you know, if the leader of the Western world, of the leader of the city on the hill, is a sort of ticking time bomb, is regarding Europeans as foes, especially Germany, if he feels NATO is purely transactional and might even be obsolete, this creates an all-over insecurity atmosphere. And in that sense, it's good that we have now President Biden in the job, even though a lot of our, let's say, high hopes were a little bit naive and blue-eyed. But I think we'll touch on that a little bit later.
So Stephen, thank you, Thomas. There's quite a lot to pick up there. So huge relief that Trump has gone. I'm picking up tensions in China, and obviously as NATO has come out from Afghanistan, that opens up an opportunity for China to invest in that region as well. What's your view on how the security landscape has changed, Stephen?
Hello, Rebecca, and I'm delighted to be with you once again. And Thomas, good to see you this fireside conversation. The first point I'd make is that I think what we really have to focus on is how the United States is going to respond in the medium to longer term to China. Because what interests me, I think, is the thought processes that are going on in Washington. And interestingly, there's quite a lot of continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on China, because America is clearly determined to take a fairly strong line with China. And so we're seeing the beginnings of the militarization of US policy towards China and the awkwardly named AUKUS relationship between US, Australia, and the UK is a case in point. The question is whether the United States is going to start to think in old traditional Cold War terms of constraining a great power, China, or even containing a great power, China, shades of the policy that was adopted towards the Soviet Union. And if the Americans do move down this route, where's that going to leave Europe? We've got President Macron talking about the importance of European strategic autonomy. Are we going to find that the US and some of its Asian allies are taking a position relating to China with which Europe, mainland Europe, the European Union is not completely comfortable? Also interesting to see whether a slightly more, maybe not slightly, but a more hardline US approach to China is going to play well with Japan or Republic of Korea or ASEAN, because there are countries and blocs who have a more nuanced view of China. They see all the negatives in China's behavior, but they see the reality of China's economic power and the need, therefore, to develop a relationship with China that protects those countries' own commercial interests. So some interesting areas here. We're looking at quite a wide strategic realignment. It's not yet clear how that's going to play out.
So I think that's super interesting, and Thomas, that really links to what you said about the economic power of China as well as the military power, and it puts Europe in a very difficult place, doesn't it? Because you've got, I mean, the Americans have formed a strategic alliance, this Quad, between Japan and Australia and India, and in the interest of trying to create a strategic alliance in the Indo-Pacific. Every region at the moment seems to be creating this kind of pivot to the Indo-Pacific, but the role of trade in that security framework is unclear, isn't it? Thomas, does that align with what you're saying?
Yeah. Let me latch on what Stephen said. If you look back to various German governments and the German political class in relation to China, you will see a certain hardening. You will see a waking up. Until, I would say, 2 years ago, we all believed that Bob Zoellick's demand for China to become a responsible stakeholder really was where we're heading to. Ever since Xi took up his leading role, and then increasingly in the last 2 years, a big disillusionment takes place. Now, we are not there where the US is asking for a decoupling, because we believe you can't decouple. You need China for climate, for instance, and you see how painful it is that she doesn't show up in Glasgow. You need China for fighting the epidemic and many other areas. On the other hand, we have created or did not pay attention to enormous dependencies on China in our economies. For instance, let me quote a German example. You know, Germany's and pretty prosperous economy is dependent on export and on trade. Now, what is our biggest trading sort of item or totem? The automobile industry. The biggest motor car company, Volkswagen, is dependent on China by more than 40%. The other German car companies by 38, 39%. Now, this is a very unhealthy situation, especially as a new government in Germany comes in, where you have two parties in the so-called traffic light coalitions who are extremely critical on China. And it's not so much a question if we want to, let's say, slowly diversify our chains of supply, disengage from China. The question is China letting Germany getting away with increasingly harsh criticisms? You know, in the past, we've had a good distribution of labor. Merkel, for 16 years, was responsible for keeping a good political and economic relationship going. And the opposition was constantly criticizing China on Hong Kong, on the Uyghurs and other things. Now, with the FDP and the Greens in government, the Chinese at one stage probably going to say, okay, if you don't stop that, we're going to hit you where it hurts most, and that is economically. And even if that is detrimental for China, China has proven, especially in its relationship with the tech industry, that they are willing and able to take some economic downsides or damage if it's necessary to force their political will on others. So China is in that respect very, very hard for us to handle. And the dichotomy to us, is this political, is it economic? I don't think you can take the two parts and separate the two sides. China is the big elephant in the room. And I don't think that Germany and perhaps Europe as a whole already has found the final answer how to deal with China, because to disengage from China economically will be extremely painful and will be take a very long time. So I would say the jury is still out here.
Stephen, what do you think?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that China was the elephant in the room, but now it's the elephant that everyone's talking about. Because if you look at the UK political spectrum, even a year ago, Sino-skepticism was rather restricted to the right wing of the Conservative Party. Now it spreads right across the Conservative Party, and I think it is part and parcel of government policy, but also it's picked up and not challenged in any way by the Labour Party opposition. I mean, there is, I think, now almost a consensus in the UK that China is a problem. And I think people do understand all the difficulties precisely because of economic dependency on China. But I think the big test is going to be COP26, the COP26 outcome and the green policies that a lot of the world, I think, is increasingly going to be signing up to and are going to be held accountable for. Because how do you have a coherent global policy on moving towards net zero if you're not confident that China is going to play its part? Of course, the jury's out as to whether China will play its part or not. And that's where Chinese politics start to come into play, because you've got Xi, who's increasingly dominant within the Chinese Communist Party, in a country where the Chinese Communist Party is, if anything, strengthening its grip on China, both politically, socially, and crucially economically. How is Xi and the Chinese Communist Party going to assess their obligations to do something about a move to net zero. They'll be pulled both ways, not least because actually the Chinese population is probably being as badly affected, if not worse, by environmental issues than a lot of us. So how China comes out in their own domestic debate, if you like, and debate within the Communist Party on the green agenda is going to play into China's wider global relationships. But a lot of uncertainty out there.
So can I just ask a sort of random question, really? Are we actually seeing, because we've got this move towards, well, I mean, effectively, it's a shifting sphere of influence, isn't it? China is becoming more powerful. It's becoming more powerful economically, and it's beginning to back up everything that it's doing with a very strong military capability as well. And so our attitude in the developed world has become more uncertain about China, and we've become more analytical of the types of strategies that China is beginning to implement. At the same time, Stephen, you make a very important point, which is that, you know, we need China. And Thomas, you said the same thing. We need China if we're going to pull together as a world around what is effectively a multilateral agenda, which is sustainability. So to what extent are we actually seeing that sustainability agenda securitized, strategized, weaponized? Is it something that's likely to become more a tool of foreign policy, as a tool of leverage by China or even the United States?
Well, if I, it reminds me a little bit of something Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Commission, said in a different context. And he said, we know exactly what to do, but we don't know how to be elected afterwards. So if you look at the sustainability issues, and it's the forefront of everybody in Germany's mind, because we are watching a coalition with the Greens, with the Liberals, and with the Social Democrats in the making. And the big issue will be sustainability, will be climate. I know that many measures are being proposed, but the question is, how sustainable is that? And sustainability means sacrifices in the longer term. Last year, we've had a ruling of the German constitutional courts who ruled the climate protection law in Germany as unconstitutional. Why? Because all the sacrifices were pushed into the far future. So they said it's not sustainable. And now to find the right balance between things which have to be done in the long run, for instance, climate neutral by 2045, as Germany is committed to, exit from coal and lignite by 2038, and they probably want to push it a little bit forward to 2030. Then we are, as far as I can see, the only major industrialized countries who very quickly wants to get out and already is getting out of nuclear and coal and fossils altogether. Now, how does that add up? How much is the population willing to bear this? I mean, you can spend money only once. You can try to shift around. You can do all sorts of, let's say, creative bookkeeping, but in the long run, it means huge sacrifices for the population, huge sacrifices to the economy, to the competitiveness of German business, and that would be the proof of the pudding. Namely, can we sustain that and still argue with stable governments, still last a whole legislation period, etc. And here I am, how should I say? I'm very, very cautious or optimistic, a little bit skeptical if we manage to do that.
There's quite an interesting dichotomy here, isn't there, between, you know, the practicality of dealing with all of this, the way in which we can use it as something to enhance domestic policy and communicate. I think you're seeing that quite clearly in Germany at the moment, that, you know, the reason why there will be a domestic focus is because of this need for transition and this really strong underpinning in Germany of sustainability as an agenda amongst the population, particularly amongst a younger population that's created this sort of green element to the traffic light coalition. But Stephen, do you think that maybe we're in a situation where we're seeing almost foreign policy becoming domesticated? It's becoming a domestic type element, because we've certainly seen that with Biden, haven't we? We've certainly seen that although he came to power, and as you said right at the beginning, Thomas, we thought he was going to have huge multilateral intentions. Actually, Stephen, you mentioned already, it's been quite domestic, his focus. It's been actually still very much focused on this sort of antagonism towards China, or keeping China at a distance anyway. So what do you think about this whole sort of sustainability, domestic, national versus foreign policy dimension to trade at the moment and security?
Well, I think Thomas made an important point, and that is that although the world needs to work together in a coordinated way to deal with the climate emergency, the impact is domestic. And so for any politician, how you pay for the green agenda has to be a very significant issue. Another issue is that I'm not sure that the global cooperative structures necessarily are very well attuned to dealing with the climate change challenge. We've got a UN Security Council, but that was developed in a former era for different purposes. We've got structures like the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and IMF, which again emerge out of the events of 1945. We've got NATO, which was designed very much for a military purpose. We don't really have the, if you like, collective security structures that enables the world to work together smoothly on dealing with climate change issues. You sort of need to reinvent a series of global cooperative mechanisms to fit the scale of the climate change emergency. And I don't think anyone at the moment is thinking very creatively about that. Where the lead comes from, don't know. I mean, in the perfect world, it would come from the United Nations system, but I'm not sure the United Nations system has got the capability to give that sort of lead.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, Stephen, I absolutely agree. The problem, or the main dilemma, is this. All the issues you just mentioned, especially sustainability, really show us how important a working multilateral rules-based system is. At the same time, you have in all the big countries the tendency to do exactly the opposite. Very skeptical of multilateralism. I mean, we are really entering, or have entered, the age of empires. China, the United States, is also increasingly behaving like an empire, not even bothering to inform close allies if they shift course. You see in the second range people like Erdogan. You see Modi. Nobody seems to be willing to really enter into a rules-based structured system. So what can we do on that? I think the trick will be to show and to prove to all countries that the pain level increases and forces us to do something. Look at the methane, what is it called? Methane agreement now in Glasgow. I think 2-3 years ago, you wouldn't have gotten the 100 countries signing up to it. I know it's still very imperfect. Some of the big guys do it later, but at least it shows an uneasiness about not doing anything, not doing enough. And closer to home, look at the state the EU is in. Brexit, I mean, Britain is out, which weakens us enormously. We have the strife with Hungary and Poland. We have in our close neighborhood very dangerous situations where the EU is just not equipped or willing to do something about it. Militarily, we still remain a dwarf. And if I look again to the new German government, I'm very, very skeptical that this traffic light coalition is really putting some punch into the concept of European autonomy, especially where it hurts, especially on the defense, security, and military side.
Stephen, open strategic autonomy, what does it mean?
It's a very good question. I wonder whether actually President Macron knows what it means. My again, I think that I can understand why the European Union, which is an extremely powerful entity, both politically and crucially economically, would want to have a degree of strategic autonomy, because they may not be comfortable with the idea of some sort of bipolarity between two power blocks, the United States and China. So they would want to make their own strategic choices. But the reality, not least because Europe is not actually particularly well armed or well equipped militarily, is that if you are looking at the security of Europe, it's very hard to provide for that security without actually having a close relationship with the United States. Which means I think that the reality for Europe is that they have got to find a way of keeping the US fully involved in European security to obviously deter Russia, to deter other threats, but also bearing in mind that quite a lot of threats now tend to be non-military, and you need to work with the United States to provide the right degree of collective defense for Europe. So in the end, I think that NATO will continue to be needed, and therefore any European strategic autonomy ambitions is going to have to be subordinated to the vital importance of maintaining a Euro-Atlantic security structure, which we call NATO. But it's going to be quite difficult to manage. There will be also, I think, differences within the European Union between the East Europeans who will say Russia, 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 and some of the West Europeans who might want a more strategic, broader global approach to security. And all that's going to be managed. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, is supposed to be working as we speak on the new NATO strategic concept to be agreed, all being well, in March next year in Madrid. Quite a challenge to actually maintain the necessary level of coherence amongst the NATO allies, and crucially that coherence between Europe and the United States. And one hopes that Joe Biden is mindful of the importance of maintaining that Euro-Atlantic relationship.
Really interesting, Thomas. We're in a position where a new German government is going to have to get its head around this, all of this in foreign policy terms pretty quickly, because I mean, Stephen's point is well made. This is complicated. Europe's own security arrangements are to some extent conflicted by the proximity to Russia and the need to contribute adequately to NATO defences as well, not just physically in terms of military, but also financially. And that's been a bone of contention, which has had a trade angle to it in terms of the relationship with the United States over the last 5 years under President Trump. So do we actually now see Europe's role changing from being, you know, not really a security element, but because that's subsumed under a NATO umbrella, but actually as a regulatory powerhouse, as a way of bringing together some of these issues around sustainability, putting the regulations in place, defining the role with China? And how does Germany's foreign policy play into all of that?
Well, I think that's a very good and interesting question, and we will have to see how the new government wants to tackle this. But coming back to the point of better coordination between the EU and NATO, as long as I can remember, for decades, this has been a bone of contention. And in the end, what we did is come to some sort of fudge to say, okay, a stronger European military role is reinforcing the pillar of the European pillar of NATO, etc. And the Germans always have had a tendency to concentrate on organizational issues, on procedural issues, and avoided the hard facts. What in the end, what counts is boots on the ground, is fighting power. Now, what I found interesting during the Trump administration, the Americans published a strategic review, a white paper. And it was interesting to see that they said, for us, the main issue, the main theater is the Pacific. So what is left for the Europeans? They said, what the Europeans can do is they can act as a sort of early warning system, a sort of tripwire. You concentrate on the Baltic Sea, you concentrate on the near abroad in Eastern Europe, and we take care of the Pacific. So I think, having said that, the new German government will repeat its pledge to be firmly anchored in NATO and the EU. It will do what is absolutely necessary, but we already see now, again, a discussion creeping up within the new coalition partners about, are we or shouldn't we be a power of peace? Is the world a safer place with ever more armaments? And I think this should, at least for old guys like me, should raise a red flag. I think this is highly dangerous, especially in times where Russia and China are very opportunistically looking where are the weak points. And we send out signals where we intend to be weak. A very interesting case in point is the pipeline, Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Okay, nobody nowadays subscribed to the Merkel description, this is a purely commercial project. It is highly political. It is even geopolitical. Now you have two partners in the coalition who are dead against the pipeline, even though it's already finished. These are the liberals for geostrategic reasons, and these are the Greens also for environmental reasons. So what are we going to do with the pipeline? Should we see it rusting away on the bottom of the Baltic Sea? No, probably what is going to happen, again, a fudge. We will, somehow make sure that the heating in Germany is going on during the winter, and say whenever Putin uses it for political purposes, we pull the switch. Well, I'm very curious to see that happening. And my worry is that the last 16 years, where we got away with a lot of fudges, with paying lip service to the one side and doing then either nothing or other things, time is running out for that. We were put on the spot by Russia, by China, by our allies across the Atlantic, and that will be very, very uncomfortable. My hope is that the good old Churchill saying, nothing focuses the mind better than being shot at, come to fruition when we really see the pain increase, when we really feel threatened, that we then have the political will and the power in our parliament to do more for our armament, to do more for our deployment of the troops, and to adopt a much more, how should I say, determined stance vis-a-vis the countries and vis-a-vis the actors which threaten us, which are, by the way, not only states. There are a lot of individuals acting out either on behalf of other states or individually. So what can I say? The jury is still out again.
Incredibly complicated, Stephen. So how does this, points really well made. How does this view of complexity play into where you think the major strategic issues are in the coming 12 months?
Yeah. Well, I think if you're looking at Europe and if you're looking at European security, always worth going back to the original text of the Washington Treaty, a very elegantly worded and very short document. And at its heart, of course, is Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. And that provides the obligation on all the members of NATO to provide collective defense in order to be able to deter and, if necessary, defeat an attack. And that ability to implement Article 5 does place a responsibility on all NATO members, as Thomas has said, to actually invest in defense, including armaments, but also, I think, in the modern world, increasingly looking at the non-military instruments of power, because the sort of attacks that you have to deal with are not just military threats. You also have to deal with cyber threats, forms of economic and trade-related warfare, the behaviors of a country like China. And the response may well, in many cases, be non-military. So NATO needs to think rather more outside the box, I think, about how you have a proper toolkit of 21st century deterrence tools, and also needs to be ready to cooperate with other institutions. Obviously, the NATO-EU relationship is crucial, difficult for obvious reasons, including Turkey, but also to be able to cooperate with whatever structures emerge in the Indo-Pacific, US dominated, but with other participants as well, to create a sense of security in the Indo-Pacific area, because it may all be about containing and constraining China, in which case Europe, EU, NATO have got to play a part in that, but they've got to play a part in that in a much more joined up way than they are at the moment. But as it is complicated, no doubt about it.
But let me ask you, Stephen, the question. Let's assume, for argument's sake, there is a military incident in the Pacific. Let's say some between China, the US, etc. Article 5?
Well, that incident would be outside the Euro-Atlantic area.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Now, I mean, as we know, when the UK was attacked in the Falkland Islands, it was very quickly established that the Falkland Islands was outside the Euro-Atlantic area, therefore Article 5 didn't apply. So it may well be that an incident in the Pacific would not be part of Article 5, but if that attack took the form of an attack on the American mainland, then maybe it would be. What happens if it was an attack on Pearl Harbor? Well, I think, again, how Article 5 is interpreted is very important. But what is essential is that any aggressor has at the back of their minds that Article 5 will be interpreted in a way which means the allies will work together for their collective defense and for their collective security. That no doubt should creep in.
Yeah, but Article 5, as McCain once said, can be a postcard and can be a nuclear rocket. I mean, we talk about appropriate measures.
Well, of course, that's the great thing about Article 5. It doesn't actually say that the response has got to be military. It's each nation, either individually or collectively, has got to take the actions that they deem appropriate. And it may well be that the appropriate response is a non-military response, which is why the sort of non-military instruments of power are extremely important. But the wording of Article 5 is very clever, but nevertheless, it should still leave potential aggressors in no doubt that NATO does have the ability to work together in a political military construct for collective defense.
So, Thomas, I guess the last word here is an important one. Against this backdrop of complexity and Article 5 having a non-military element to it, potentially in its interpretation, are we actually against that backdrop likely to see Europe having potentially the capacity to regulate, or the potentially also to withhold cars from China or something like that? Are there non-military means, that trade means effectively, that Europe can use as a way of exhibiting its power rather than military ones?
Yes, there are, of course, there is a toolbox. There are many things one could do on the trade side, on rule setting, on international taxation, etc. The question is, can Europe bring the political will of 27 countries together? And in the past, it was often the joint leadership of Germany and France to do that, not because they like each other so much, but because only these two big countries coming from opposite sides of the spectrum of interest, when they forged the painful compromises, others followed. And I think it's not a given any longer. It's not a given any longer because France is entering the campaign for the presidential elections. What the outcome of the German coalition negotiations is still open. You have countries who openly define the whole system of the EU. So I cannot make prophecies. I only can express the hope that when the pain level increases, when the threat level increases, that Europe finds the will and the capability to do the right things, as they have done in various crises in the past. I mean, it's not as if Europe has been totally useless. I mean, as a reaction to the pandemic, for instance, the EU Next Generation Fund was a huge effort, and not least by a country who was part of the, let's say, fiscally more restrictive countries, Germany. It was a huge effort for Germany. And if I see the public announcement, if I read them correctly, I think that a certain development in Europe towards more debt mutualization, towards more financial solidarity is developing in this new coalition. And in that sense, I think we see a real difference to the former CDU governments, and now with a more left-leaning traffic light coalition. So that might be a development which you will see. And since Britain is out, the blocking minority of the fiscally conservative countries is gone. You see, so the Club Méditerranée, the French and the others, they really have the majority. And if you then look again, the reasons and the timing why Weidmann resigned from the Bundesbank and got out of the ECB indicates a certain direction, which I think will lead to more solidarity in Europe, even shown by Germany.
So I'll ask both of you this final question, starting with you, Thomas. In 12 months' time, this is now becoming a habit. So the three of us have talked for the last 3 years, and I sort of feel like we're getting progressively less certain about the strategic world that we live in, and progressively more worried about the potential for proper conflict. So what are we going to be talking about in 12 months' time?
Well, hopefully we're talking about that the threat, the uncertainty, the need to do something will convince our parliament, and in the end, the people in the street, that we finally have to do something which might be painful in the short run in order for the greater good. And we've seen it is possible. We've seen that with the peace movement in the early 80s, which forced Helmut Schmidt to resign. In the end, we did the right thing. But perhaps we have lived in a how should I say, in a situation or in the feeling of prosperity and security, which does not chime with the harsh realities. And will have to see the harsh realities sink in the next couple of months. And so then hopefully we meet in different circumstances in a year.
And hopefully face to face. Stephen.
I think we're going to be talking about financial and economic risk. The thing that we probably all should be worrying about most at the moment is inflation. And that inflationary pressure is going to be probably driven, if we're investing more and more in green technologies and so on. And that will impact on people's living standards and therefore on economic and political stability. And it's a problem for all of us. It includes China as well as the United States and Europe. So I suspect we're going to be talking about what may be a rather uncertain global economic outlook. And at its heart is the sense that right across the planet, people are going to have to come to terms with the fact that their living standards are no longer going to significantly increase. And that will impact on all of us in Beijing, London, Berlin, and you name it. We'll all be worrying about the same thing, which is essentially our own quality of life.
Stephen, Thomas, thanks as always for a tour de force of the security and strategic landscape affecting everywhere around the world. For me, the big takeaway is the fact that we're living in an environment of immense uncertainty, and that actually we're almost at a pivot point where we have to accept some very unpleasant truths, inconvenient truths even, in order to be able to be talking positively about the changes that we've made this time next year. Let's hope this time next year is indeed face to face. It's wonderful talking to you as always, and thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.